Psychoanalysis, the name of the name, letter is lost. Namaste. Ever since Lacan brought in the concept of the name of the father in etiology of psychosis and perversion, long silent waters have been stirred. Conversation today is a deep excavation into the mysterious realm of genesis of psychosis and perversion. Guide in the journey is psychoanalysis consultant, Dr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
So, rolling out the basics, what is Lacan's idea of the name of the father?
Lacan's idea of the name of the father refers to the paternal function in the psyche. If we look at the psyche as a system which is brought into equilibrium by two movements, the movement of eros and the movement of logos. If we conceptualize the psyche in this way, you can also talk about, roughly speaking, not accurately, but roughly speaking, eros as the force of the desire and logos as the force of reality, logic, and ideals. So what happens is there is a force of infinite desires, infinite eros, stopped only by the principle of survival, ideals, reality, morality. And this stopping principle, this coordinating principle, this directing principle, this proportion calibrating principle is the principle of logos. Some people call this eros as the maternal function and the logos as the paternal function. So Lacan's name of the father refers to the paternal function. And this name establishes itself in the mind at some point in development. In that sense, Lacan is more of a Freudian rather than a Kleinian. Because for Klein, the paternal function associated with guilt is inborn. Whereas for Freud, it is developed at the end of the Oedipus. So for Lacan, the name of the father establishes itself in the mind, which means the paternal function, the reality function, the adaptability function, the ideal function establishes itself in the developmental process. So in that sense, he is more Freudian than Kleinian on this point. Roughly speaking, if you want to equate with Freudian concepts, very roughly speaking, not accurately, but roughly speaking, the name of the father is equal to ego plus superego.
Okay.
Because both of them are the paternal functions, whereas id is the maternal function in the Freudian scheme of things. So the name of the father is what brings in the reality principle. So as Freud used to say, where id is, ego shall be. The goal of therapy. So the ego that he is referring to is actually a combination of ego and superego both, the paternal function. Meaning the paternal function will be able to control, guide, and direct the maternal function. So Lacan's name of the father refers to that paternal function, the reality principle in older language. The difference being, the name of the father is informed, constituted by, has the support of, is anchored in two primary sources apart from the constitution, but the two primary sources are very interesting in the Lacanian scheme of things. The two primary sources are the small other and the big other. The small other, like there is a child and everything that is not the child is the other. Now the other can be further subdivided. In many ways, Lacan uses one way, which is to say, the parents are together, the caregivers together are called the small other. And the rest of the society culture, history, everything that has at any time been or at present is in the human world, all of that heritage or even the present uh, social luggage, so to say, or social, let me say, the social capital, social luggage, inheritance, all of that is put together under the name of the big other. So language, science, philosophy, values, much of it comes even to the small other from the big other. Like the small other is not self-sufficient. The small other derives much of its values from the big other. So in that sense, the whole of human heritage and the whole of society at present is brought into psychoanalysis through the concept of the big other. Now, this small other and the big other both influence the constitution and the establishment of the name of the father. And as Lacan says, in psychosis, the primary mechanism is of incapability to establish the name of the father. Whereas in perversion, it is the disavowal. It is the erasure of the name of the father. So for Lacan, in the etiology of psychosis and perversion, the name of the father is one of the central concepts. That in in psychosis, there is an incapability of establishing the name of the father. Whereas in perversion, there is a willful erasure of the name of the father. So for Lacan, the name of the father is a very central concept when it comes to psychosis and perversion.
So why should this concept stir the long silent psychoanalysis?
Any fresh concept which challenges the established concepts in psychoanalysis always stirs up cold waters, settled waters. And in that stirring, both things happen. Mud comes up and it's fling at each other. At the same time, the water also purifies itself. The pond of the water also expands. So both the things happen with advent of any fresh, fundamental, original thinking. In Lacanian conceptualization, the same things happen. Every school in psychoanalysis before Lacan has its own idea about why psychosis happens. So the absence of the name of the father is not the only way the etiology of psychosis can be described. Every school has its own idea why psychosis happens, which means every school has its own name for the name that Lacan calls the name of the father. Which means that name has many names, one name in each school. So if you go to the Freudian conceptualization, the non-resolution of Oedipus is the name of that name. What Lacan calls the name of the father, instead of the name of the father, the name of that name, the cause of psychosis in Freudian conceptualization would be unresolved Oedipus. In Kleinian conceptualization, it will be the absence of the good breast, too much aggression and presence of the bad breast. In case of ISTDP, it will be too much bottled up rage, sadness, and guilt. In case of Winnicott, it will be the absence of a good enough mother. In case of Kohut, it will be lack of a healthy self and therefore lack of adequate ego strength. In case of Jung, it will be too much firing of an archetype which is dysfunctional and too little firing of a contrary or a balancing archetype. In case of more systems-oriented thinkers, it will be a systemic failure at healthy coordination of different parts and functions of the system. So this name has many names. From good breast to Oedipus to ego strength to presence of a good enough mother and so on. In beyond, it will be the good container. So what Lacan calls that the name is actually the name of the father. So if this name is what prevents psychosis or causes psychosis, this absence causes psychosis, then each school has its own explanation of what is the name of this thing. And obviously we find patients of all types where one school or the other applies. So obviously what Lacan calls the name of the father, the name does not have one name, the name has many names. And we are yet to find a coherent theory where we can find reasons why so many names of the name exist in so many different patients.
Does it say eros is fundamental and logos an addition to it?
In one sense, yes. In the sense, let us say the name of the father is not completely established. So what exists there before its establishment? It is the eros. It is the imaginary order. It is the difficult real order. In Freudian terms, it is the id. So in that sense, the desire and the outcomes of desire, the fantasies, the drives, feelings and thoughts related to those desires, they come first. And the coordinating function comes later. So at the first glance, it looks like that eros is fundamental, logos is a later acquisition. And eros comes first, logos comes later. But if we go deeper, then we find something else. We find that what we call logos is actually a higher order cognitive entity. But if we go into higher order cognitive, logos is a higher order cognitive entity.
Higher order cognitive entity.
But if we go into the genesis of affect itself, if we go into the operationalizing of desire in terms of eros, how desire converts into affect, into eros, that itself involves a cognitive function. So logos we can't equate to a cognitive function, which many people do. Even in generation of affect, cognition is involved. For example, let's say I like a pastry and I'm denied once for 2 years. And then you have a pastry put in front of me. Now, when I see it, how much happiness should be generated inside of me? How much affect should be generated? That evaluation happens by a cognitive function. So cognitive function precedes and decides the volume of affect. So if you look at that cognitive function that precedes eros, eros itself is generated at the end of that cognitive function. So there is a surface cognition, a conscious cognition, an unconscious cognition, and there is a evaluative cognition. The evaluative cognition precedes eros, but eros would precede the higher order conscious and unconscious cognition. So this is a double thing, that if we look at those macro higher level cognitive entities, the logos, then of course eros precedes it. But if we consider logos in its generic form as a cognitive function, then the evaluative cognitive function precedes the generation of affect and therefore the generation of eros. In fact, it's interesting to see how the confusion comes up here, because the evaluative cognition is much before the even the unconscious cognition that we find by analysis, and beyond therefore called psychosis. Very interestingly and very ironically, almost strangely, at its core, a cognitive phenomenon, which is unique because most people think of psychosis essentially as an affective phenomenon. That unpleasant affect is so high and the pleasant affect is so low in the past, in the present, and in anticipated future, that the mind has no way to accept reality and deal with it, rather create its own, or retreat into oneself, saying goodbye to any sort of reality, either outside or created by inside. So there, most of us look at it as an affective phenomenon. Beyond looks at it as a cognitive phenomenon. And the way he conceptualizes is very interesting about, he says it is inability or the refusal to accept the knowledge of reality. It is the refusal of true knowledge at the core of psychosis. He calls it minus K. If K is knowledge, then it is minus K. Establishment of wrong knowledge and refusal of right knowledge. This refusal coming from a variety of factors, including hatred, including envy, including narcissistic rage. But at its core, the etiology operates at its roots from a cognitive function. This cognitive function again is affected by affective currents. But beyond does not go into those affective currents so much. He just goes into this fact that there is a minus K. But if you ask why the minus K is minus K, then the affective factors would come.
Amen.
If you look again into eros and logos, it's almost like a BDSM relationship, a master-slave relationship between eros and logos.
Right.
That in general, logos keeps eros in control. Occasionally, eros becomes the master and turns logos into its slave. And that is where the psychotic difficulties start off.
So if it is in a name, then what are the letters that make this name?
There are many ways one can look at it. Let us say we start off with the name of the father cannot be established, stabilized. First, it can be that the capacity to establish it is not there. Meaning, the flood of the eros is too high. Logos just can't establish itself. It's just drowned in the flood of eros. Second possibility can be that the eros acts not by drowning logos, but by capturing logos. That is where the perversion comes, that you erase the name of the father willfully. And it requires far more ego strength to erase than to be flooded and drowned. And in erasure, there can be constitutional basis also, which can be very strong in psychopathy. Because in psychopathy, there is no hesitation in erasing it. The erasure is certain, clear, and willful. In psychosis, the name of the father cannot establish because there is a diffidence. There is no ground on which the plane can land. One interesting difference I would point out between sociopathy and psychopathy is, in sociopathy, there is a hesitation to erasure. And therefore, there is a partial erasure, often a circumscribed erasure. Whereas in psychopathy, the erasure is certain, clear, and very decisive and willful. There is no hesitation.
In Lacanian view, psychopathy is more of perversion based thing, and while the sociopathy can be the psychotic version of it.
No, both are perversions, but the degree is different.
The intensity is different.
And there is a constitutional difference between the two. The hesitation in the sociopath is because of the presence of the superego, at least to some extent. But in psychopathy, the superego is either near absent or very
bare minimum.
Bare minimum. So that is why the name of the father cannot adequately establish itself and be stable in either of the cases. Now, if we go into the Freudian realm, the name of the father cannot be established and stabilized because of various reasons. Much of it owes to the Oedipus. And this can take various forms. The eros can be so high that Oedipus cannot be resolved. And often, it can also lead to a situation where the narcissistic expansion, inflation is so high that the narcissistic inflation erases much of the superego, resulting in a superego pathology, because the name of the father cannot be stabilized, adequately established. Similarly, the inadequate internalization of a good object can also lead to a similar problem. A lack of good enough mothering, lack of creation of the healthy self. Some more deeper aspects of this are the fear of merging back or being sucked into the mother. The fear of invasion of fantasized objects into oneself. The fear of castration. The fear of horrifying objects put into the vagina. The fear of horrifying objects lurking in the dark. The fear of fragmentation and ceasing to exist in an annihilatory phenomena. The fear of endless torture. The fear of fantasized objects, often reptiles, torturing and devouring one alive. The use of disgust as a mechanism to cover up Oedipus. and the disgust in turn leading to superego rage, which cannot be contained, which can result in somebody getting violent. The difficulty of too strong a repressive mechanism and too strong an earth element, which often leads to catatonic scheme of spectrum difficulties. That the difficulty there is that not only is the negative effect high in volume, but there is a very strong ego capable of repressing. Neither projection nor projective identification will happen, but everything will get just bottled up and create a high pressure situation inside, ultimately getting more and more into catatonic state. Some of the regressions to primary narcissism, where I would say happy to erase the name of the father, which is not perversion. It's a very different happy to erase name of the father. It's not perversion. It's a different state. Lacan did not conceptualize about this state, that there is an erasure, not erasure, I would say. There is a
denial.
No, there is a recoloring of the name of the father. That recoloring often takes a superego color. But apart from this element of the recolored name of the father, which often has the color of the superego, the regression is total. The person is not functional in the world of work and often has one or two psychotic features. So this is...
when you say recoloring of the superego, is it to do that then the pathology, the effect is projected on superego, and that's why then it becomes a pathology of superego?
No, what happens is the fixation in primary narcissism is very high and the ego strength is very low.
Okay.
The desire and the entitlement of success is very high. If correspondingly substance is not adequate, opportunity and luck is not adequate, then one is frustrated with the outside world. Now here what happens is because there is already a strong fixation in the primary narcissism stage, one goes back. And the joy of primary narcissism is so high that no amount of therapy will persuade the man to come out and live in the real world and accept the difficulties of life. The joy of primary narcissism is so seductive and so addictive. Now, the regression is going on. The person is slowly cutting off from therapy, but he is not going catatonic. More often than not, although he has a couple of psychotic features and he is withdrawing what we call the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. In catatonia also you see the negative symptoms. In the regression to primary narcissism also you see the negative symptoms. In both cases there is a withdrawal from the world, refusal to engage. But in this case of regression to primary narcissism, the withdrawal is not as total as in catatonia. And the self-inflation happens by considering oneself to be a great saint or a great prophet or a revealer or somebody. So the fantasy is still psychotic, but in his mind, he is becoming one with his superego. So what happens is the name of the father gets recolored to suit his regression to primary narcissism. Like he's not a pervert, he won't do the acts that a pervert would do. So there is no erasure of the name of the father. There is no absence of the name of the father. Rather, there is a recoloring of the name of the father. So the name of the father takes a very different name here. It's recolored. And these are some of the issues why the name of the father cannot be adequately stabilized, established and stabilized. Lacan did not go much deeper into the grounds for the inadequacy and inadequate stabilizing of the name of the father. He just left it more to constitution. But other schools have found reasons for it. And by practice in counseling and therapy also we see different reasons why the name of the father cannot be adequately established and stabilized.
So is the concept of the name in Beyond's Nameless dread same as here?
No.
Okay.
Because Beyond's concept of the name that ends the nameless dread. Beyond's concept of the name is actually a word that closes the infinity, and a word that completes the cognitive process. It is the alpha function working on the beta elements to result in a word, and the word completes the process, and therefore the dread, the open infinity, the difficult effects that accompany the presence of the beta elements is no longer felt. And there is peace, there is relief, there is coherence as the alpha function completes its work and the word comes to be. Lacan's name is a much higher order name than Beyond's name. Beyond's name is very elemental, at the root of cognitive processes, at the root of the precognitive stage. But in Lacan, it's a much higher order entity, an entity that is very meaningful. It's already loaded with many concepts. It's an aggregate entity. It's not an elemental entity. It's an aggregate entity. It's almost a mechanism that produces coordination, coherence, adjustment, adaptability, alignment with ideals, alignment with reality. So it's a much higher order construct, an aggregate of many entities, a mechanism of many entities. Whereas Beyond's name is a very elemental entity, which is at the root of every cognitive process, even isolated ones. And therefore, the two are different. It's Beyond's name is very different from Lacan's name. Beyond's name is very elemental. Lacan's name is a higher order evolved aggregating entity, it is a high order psychic mechanism.
Deep, esoteric and complicated, yet equally enriching. See you all again. Thank you so much, Dr. Vaidya. Namaste.
Namaste.